Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Measuring Up, Moist Philosophy. We use measuring instruments to help us in our daily activities. A tire pressure indicator if our bicycle wheel seems a little flat, baking scales and thermometers, or a step counter to tell us whether we've done our 10,000 steps today. The group of early Chinese thinkers, known as the Moists, proposed that we take the same approach to our moral lives. Much as we would use a compass to point us in the right direction, we know that using guiding standards for a range of human activities can help us to do things better. In fact, in this mini-series of episodes on Moism, we will consider how they applied the idea of standards to a range of topics, including ethics, politics, war, and what we might call logic and philosophy of language. We should begin with the movement's founding text, the Mozi. We will see the range of ideas associated with this tradition, and looking at this work will tell us more about who its authors might have been. The Mozi itself identifies the person, Mozi, as the movement's leader, taking his views as authoritative. In this way, parts of the Mozi text are similar to the Analects. Some passages portray a person coming to consult with Mozi on his views. Others begin with Mozi said, followed by an explanation of the implications of whatever he says. But unlike the Analects or the Mengzi, the Mozi does not belong to the genre of court writing, a genre characteristic of extant texts from the Warring States period in China, as we've seen a number of episodes back. We'll say more about this later. The Mozi is a 71-chapter text, although 18 of them have been lost. Its chapters were most likely composed during the Warring States period and subsequently compiled in the form that we know, during the Han period. The 71 chapters covered a variety of topics, pretty much the ones we just said we'll be covering in the upcoming episodes: morality, politics, war, and military matters, epistemology, logic, and language. Some of its chapters, such as those on military matters, cover more focused topics, including tactics in defensive war. A set of chapters known as the Canons, Mu Jing, discuss a range of more technical topics, including epistemology, language and syntax, logical categories, optics, mechanics, and geometry. Scholars believe that the canons were composed later during the Warring States period. Of its remaining chapters, which cover topics broadly within moral, social, and political philosophy, there's a set of 30 core chapters, which are organized thematically. These comprise 10 sets of 3 chapters each, with each set of 3 bearing the same title, such as Condemnation of Aggression in War, 1, 2, and 3. For this reason, they're also sometimes called the triplets or triads. There are important variations in each set of 3, sufficient for some scholars to think that the subsequent essays in each set were written later and reflect developments of thought in response to different concerns over time. Over the next few episodes, we will discuss ideas in these core chapters, while later episodes will focus on the canons. For some reason, or for a number of reasons, the Mozi was not a widely known text after the Han period. In fact, the canons became separated from the earlier chapters of the Mozi, and it was not until the 15th century that it resurfaced, published in the Taoist canon. Perhaps it was due to the dense technical language of the canons that the Mozi was not more popular. But this doesn't account for the Mozi's other chapters. The Mozi's writing style in quite a few of its sections is ponderous and repetitive. This might be because some of its authors were not erudite men of learning with high political status. Although texts such as the Analects and Mengzi circulated together with commentaries that helped articulate their insights, this was not the case with the Mozi. It did not attract commentators during the Han period, perhaps because Han scholars were disinclined to engage with a work critical of existing power structures. It's also telling that there is scant information on the Moists themselves. There is some mention of a small number of individual Moists, but these references do not tell us about the identities of these men. Again, this is a contrast to Confucianism, where we are reasonably well informed about the disciples of Kongzi, to say nothing of the many stories about the master himself and what we know of the careers of Mengzi and Xunzi. The Moists rejected the views and goals of the elites in their time. Although they might not have singled out the Confucians for censure, some of their criticisms about elitism and the views and practices of the Warring States period clearly apply to the Confucian vision of a thriving society. For instance, while the Confucian reference points are men who serve in government, such as the Junzi, the Mozi often takes its examples from the working trades. It could be that the authors of the Mozi did not belong to the clique of erudite officials, considering that they seem to have close knowledge of manual work. This brings us back to the idea of measurement. For the Moists, standards, fa, should effectively guide human activities, including the way we conduct ourselves in the same way a carpenter's square helps carpenters to make functional objects. One of its chapters, entitled On Dyeing, is not really about how to apply color to cloth, but applies metaphors from the work of dyers to conduct in official life and government. The Mozi uses a range of argumentative strategies, including reasoning by analogy, as with this chapter about dyeing, as well as appeals to intuition, hypotheticals, reductio ad absurdum, which means taking an opponent's view to its logical conclusion, which results in an absurd position, and rejection of appeals to custom or tradition. The Mozi would be amongst the earliest known texts from China that, in addition to putting forth arguments, also explores how different argumentative devices are better suited to strengthening one's case. Like a reflective craftsman, the Moist philosopher is a skilled user of his tools, and also understands why each tool is suited for its purpose. One telling instance in which the Mozi discusses a tool and then shows how it works is its method of using the 3 tests to decide on whether a teaching or a doctrine or a practice may be adopted. The Mozi specifically says that when doctrines are being debated, there needs to be a standard to determine which one is acceptable. Some chapters set out to demonstrate that the Mozi's views hold up against one or more of the tests. The 3 tests are as follows. First, a doctrine must have proper roots in the deeds of the ancient sage kings. Second, a doctrine must be grounded in appropriate sources, which means that it must be verified by examining the reality that the common people's ears hear and eyes see. And third, a doctrine must be useful. The third test involves trying out the doctrine, like giving it a dry run to see if it benefits the state, the 100 clans, and the people. The first test is applied by the Mozi in the following way. What did the sage kings actually do, and what did their deeds help bring about? For example, in a chapter entitled On Moderation, it is said that the sage kings initiated the production of basic necessities, such as clothing, houses, armor, and vehicles, to enable conveniences in work and life. Regarding vehicles, the passage reads simply and clearly, Sage kings made carts to travel on hills and plains, and boats to travel through rivers and valleys, to provide the benefit of transportation across the 4 corners of the world. In all cases, the way of making boats and carts is, what adds lightness and convenience, select it. What doesn't add this, eliminate it. According to this passage, the sage kings have set a precedent for moderation in expenditure. The passage concludes with a statement about the importance of frugality in the sage kings' initiatives. In all cases of their making these things, they did nothing that did not add usefulness. Thus they used resources without wasting anything, the people were not worn out, and they promoted much benefit. The fact that the sage kings were moderate in spending thus counts as one argument against excessive expenditures, particularly amongst the significant minority who governed the country. Of course, when the Mozi appeals to these admired historical figures, it is not taking an unusual step within Warring States discourse. We have seen how Confucian philosophy's ideal society is grounded in the moral leadership of sages, rulers, and officials who are exemplary. Through moral influence, they will inspire people to develop their moral capacities. The Mozi's appeals to sage kings are somewhat more muted in comparison, in that there seems to be more emphasis on their deeds rather than on their moral qualities. In the example above, the sage king's deeds are important, not simply because they were performed by these men, but because they brought benefit to the people. The second test, which involves verification by what the common people hear and see, was a more unusual move in its time. Other Warring States thinkers generally saw the views of the common people as unreliable. Furthermore, the Moist test works on the basis of consensus, one that relies on the views of a community of believers. As the scholar Anne Birdwistell points out, although seeking consensus was not unheard of during this time, it was recognized as problematic because consensus did not necessarily lead to truth. One can easily imagine the Confucians objecting here and pointing to their observation that the views of the common folk simply follow those of their leaders, like grass bending in the blowing wind. This makes it all the more remarkable that the Mozi proposes sampling the views of ordinary people. Putting aside the question of whether the common people in the Mozi's time were equipped to express their views or ready to do so, the Mozi seems to be saying, let's listen to what the common people have to say. The Mozi does not tell us why it thinks the views of the common people are important, but this could well go hand in hand with its anti-elitist stance. Benefit or utility, li, is the third test and the most important among the three. In the Mozi, whether something brings benefit or causes harm is considered from the perspective of everyone, including the common people. Practices or doctrines that only benefit a select few fail this test. And the Mozi says that music fails this test. A chapter specifically entitled Condemning Music puts the entire enterprise of music, its instruments, performances, and functions through this test. The passages in this chapter bring out many disbenefits of music. Musical instruments are costly. Music is useless in meeting the basic needs of the people and in preventing disorder. People get distracted by music and do not properly undertake productive activities, and music creates an unequal society in which the performers do not themselves produce resources but are reliant on others' productive activities to be clothed and fed with fine materials and food. Finally, heavy taxes would have to be imposed to sustain these music practices. The Mozi reaches the same conclusion about the unsustainability of music several times in this chapter, saying, now, kings, dukes, and great men, if they make music, rob the people's resources for clothing and food to this great extent to hold musical performances. Thus our master, Mozi, said, making music is wrong. In this case, you don't have to be a Confucian to object to what the Moists are apparently saying. But their argument is not aimed against, say, craftspeople whistling while they work, or indeed what we commonly refer to as music. It is rather the kind of music associated with ritual in the courts of princes. These practices are carried out at great expense and therefore fail this test. As Moism scholar Chris Fraser puts it, the Moist target is music enjoyed by a privileged minority. Moists of today might therefore object to ballet and opera, but not hip-hop, EDM, K-pop, or Afrobeats. By the same token, official rituals that are similarly lavish also fail the test, and of course in many official ceremonies, both ritual and music are central to the event. So this test also rules out expensive burial rituals. In these rituals, the dead are dressed in embroidered clothes and buried with precious jewels and a large number of crafted burial items. If a king dies, his attendants are buried alive with him. The customary 3-year mourning period fails the test too, as mourners cry themselves hoarse, deny themselves comfort, and do not contribute to the production of wealth. Some listeners will remember the hapless Confucian follower Zai Wo, whom Kongzi compared to rotten wood because he slept during the day. He wanted to get out of the 3-year mourning period, saying that 1 year was long enough. Maybe he should have changed his philosophical allegiance, as he would have been quite happy to go along with the Mozi's argument to scrap the long mourning period. On the other hand, all that running around and benefiting people sounds like it could involve setting an early alarm clock. Poor Zai Wo, he probably thought he'd finally be safe once we got to the Moists. As benefit does indeed have the central place in the Mozi's views, we should take a closer look at what the Moists mean by it. For them, heaven is the ultimate model that brings forth benefit for all. The Mozi presents a version of a creation story, which has it that heaven put in place the sun, moon, and stars, regulates the seasons, and sends down rain, frost, and dew. This allows plants to grow, and thus people benefit from these resources. This is another feature of Moism with parallels in other Warring States texts, which often appeal to heaven as the ultimate source or locus of morality. The Mozi is only the most prominent example. The Mozi also imbues heaven with yi, rightness, which is again a term widely used and associated with morality. Heaven is the benefactor that is paradigmatically inclusive, and therefore heaven's rightness is what humans should model themselves upon. The Mozi says in 2 contrasting ways how heaven and rightness are connected. In a chapter entitled Heaven's Intent, it is said that heaven desires rightness and detests its opposite. This means that rightness is a primary value, which heaven seeks to embrace. In the second version of this chapter, rightness is said to issue from heaven. This second version implies that heaven is in control of what is right. Here we may be reminded of a dialogue by Plato called the Euthyphro, and not for the first time. Back in episode 9, we discussed a passage in which Mozi said that the sage king Shun would have abdicated the throne to save his father from being prosecuted for murder, an example which is frequently compared to Euthyphro's contrasting decision to prosecute his own father for murdering a slave. Here, we may instead think of the so-called Euthyphro dilemma. Are things beloved by the gods because they are pious, or are they pious because they are beloved by the gods? So here we may ask whether benefiting people is right because heaven wants it, or the other way around. Heaven wants benefit because it is right. We'll come back to this in the next episode. Whatever the origins of rightness, the Mozi affirms that heaven embodies it, and thus is the model for humanity. The Mozi's appeal to heaven has yet another dimension, though, namely its role as the moral judge of human actions. Although it is beneficent, as we have seen, heaven also operates a reward and punishment system. Those who follow heaven's intention, inclusively caring about each other and in interaction, benefiting each other, surely get rewarded. Those who oppose heaven's intention, excluding and detesting each other, and in interaction, injuring each other, surely get punished. In these chapters about heaven, we also find a moral map of humans, with different sets of people placed in different categories. This demographic of human morality tells us why sages are sages, as their deeds have been recognized and rewarded by heaven. Conversely, tyrants have been punished for their bad deeds, and even their descendants have been punished. There's also a moral hierarchy ranging from the common people to officers, ministers, lords, the Son of Heaven, and finally to heaven itself. Each group is supposed to identify upward, as it is put in the title of another triad of chapters, and the hierarchy stops at heaven. We mentioned earlier that the Mozi appeals to sage kings and to heaven, just like the Warring States Confucian texts do. However, Moist references to heaven are more specific, more personal. Heaven is an agent that, or perhaps we should say who, delivers moral justice on the basis of whether people have acted to benefit others. Unlike Confucianism, where sages possess moral authority in their own right, Moism places authority only in heaven. There's only one standard upheld in the Mozi, and that sits with heaven. In yet another application of the measuring analogy, heaven's intent is compared to the wheelwright's compass and the carpenter's set square. Humans may aim to act with rightness and benevolence, but heaven is the unambiguous standard. The Mozi is emphatic that no human can offer what heaven offers. For the Confucians, the sage kings lead by their moral charisma and exemplary lives, but for the Moists, they, like everyone else, have to measure up to heaven's rightness. This could well be a Moist strategy to take the prerogative of determining moral values out of the hands of the elites. We get a sense that the Mozi seeks to question the moral authority invested in men, as it puts the Son of Heaven, the ruler, in his place. When the Son of Heaven has an illness or misfortune, he must fast and bathe, and prepare pure offerings of wine and grain to sacrifice to heaven and the ghosts, for heaven can't dispel it. Yet I've never known heaven to pray for blessings to the Son of Heaven. This is how I know heaven is more noble and wise than the Son of Heaven. This is a bold claim as it challenges the authority of the ruler, but the Moist argument was powerful in its historical context, given that one could hardly deny that rulers are dependent on heaven's mandate. This was an ingenious move. If the Moists felt that they could not offer an alternative vision based on their learned or perspicacious insights, or on the basis of their standing in society, it was important to justify their views elsewhere, and they took it beyond humanity. Their appeal to heaven as the model of beneficence anchors the Moist ideal in a source that even the Son of Heaven, held in the highest esteem by the Confucians, cannot match. Significant moves are made in this text to unsettle the entrenched power of the elites. The Moist conception of benefiting all inclusively broadens the aim of morality to directly benefit the many, especially in terms of material well-being. It spoke out against the unfair distribution of goods, as well as the entrenched hierarchy in society. As a text of its time, the Mozi is familiar with official discourse, and it subtly alters the meanings of key terms to establish its arguments. The rationale for using standards to determine the plausibility of doctrines was an innovation in the 4th century BCE, and the application of criteria for assessing doctrines introduced a degree of objectivity to argument hitherto unseen in early Chinese thought. It was not up to the charisma of its proponent, or based on his status or on the weight of tradition, that a doctrine should be adopted. Instead, the Moists attempted to provide the common people with a tool for calibrating their moral lives using the measure of inclusive benefit. This would be a standard applied to everyone, and one that would take discretion out of the hands of the officials. But what exactly did the Moists mean by benefit, and how demanding was the moral theory that they fashioned using this tool? This is what we'll be discussing in the next episode. At the risk of hammering home the point, we'll ask you to wrench yourself away from whatever else you might be doing to join us for that here on the History of Philosophy in China.